From APM, American Public Media.
Duke Energy, committed to using technologies designed to reduce storm-related outages, including grid advancements to reroute power while repairs are made, and tools to remotely assess damage and help speed restoration. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Launches a surprise attack on Iran, but are we at war? We talked to Jacksonville University public policy expert Rick Mullaney about how the country and the world is reacting to the news and what the road ahead might bring. Then, mangroves on the move, how the northward march of the red mangrove could help and harm local ecosystems. And why summer may be the best time to start thinking about back to school. We'll tell you about how you can get your kids enrolled in free preschool. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at WJCT.
Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. Brent crude prices opened slightly higher today after the U.S. bombing of 3 nuclear sites in Iran over the weekend. Iran's the third largest producer of oil in the world oil cartel, OPEC. That's despite U.S. sanctions on its exports. NPR's Ea Betrawi has more.
There are concerns the Gulf's oil and gas could be targeted should the war expand. Iran's Press TV reported that Iran's elected parliament approved a measure to close the Strait of Hormuz, a vital passageway in the Gulf for a fifth of the world's oil and gas, including from heavyweight Saudi Arabia. It's seen as a largely symbolic decision, though, because it requires approval from Iran's top security council. Any disruption would immediately affect top importers like China, India, and Pakistan. Dubai-based energy consultancy Gulf Intelligence says 2 liquefied natural gas plants belonging to Qatar and the UAE are located inside the strait. And it says there's enough crude oil stocks in the world to offset any potential dips in Iranian exports, but only so long as the Strait of Hormuz remains open. Ea Betrawi, NPR News, Dubai.
New York City will hold primary elections tomorrow, and the Democratic contest for mayor is very hot. There are 11 Democrats running for the nomination to succeed Mayor Eric Adams. He is running for re-election as an independent. From member station WNYC, senior reporter Bridget Bergen says large numbers of New York City voters have already cast ballots.
We are seeing turnout rates that are more than double where they were at this point in early voting 4 years ago. You know, there is real attention being paid to the fact not only are the numbers coming out much higher than they were 4 years ago, but also based on our analysis of who is actually voting, the voters who are coming out are also younger.
Bridget Bergen reporting. New York City is also using ranked choice voting for the very first time. A federal judge in San Antonio has ruled that the state of Texas has been illegally placing people with severe disabilities in nursing homes. Texas Public Radio's Dan Katz reports the judge gave the state of Texas and the plaintiffs till August 1st to propose a fix to the violations.
U.S. District Judge Orlando Garcia found that the state of Texas for decades unnecessarily institutionalized 4,500 people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in nursing homes, denying them appropriate services that are required under federal law. Garcia called the problem severe and ongoing, dating back to a statute Congress passed in 1987 that requires screening to identify community programs instead of automatically institutionalizing people.
And while they're there, we're not getting even minimally adequate levels of services that is required by federal law.
That's Stephen Schwartz, special counsel at the Center for Public Representation. He filed a class action lawsuit 15 years ago and called the ruling a landmark decision. I'm Dan Katz in San Antonio.
And you're listening to NPR News from Washington.
You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning, I'm Stephen Ponson. It's 9:04. Alabama-based Twin Pines Minerals has thrown in the towel after 6 years of trying to get a mining permit for land just outside the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge in southeast Georgia. The Conservation Fund, a national environmental nonprofit, announced on Friday that it will pay $60 million to buy the nearly 8,000 acres Twin Pines owns along the eastern edge of the Blackwater Swamp. The Okefenokee straddles the Florida-Georgia border. Scientists and environmentalists who worried the proposed mining operation would cause irreparable harm to the swamp and to the St. Mary's and Swanee rivers are celebrating the purchase. Clay County will soon have its first Aldi location. The store in Fleming Island that was converted from a Winn-Dixie is scheduled to open this Thursday. The store on County Road 220 will be open from 9 in the morning until 8 in the evening daily, according to news partners of the Jacksonville Daily Record. Back in March 2024, Aldi bought Jacksonville-based Southeastern Grocers, Inc. with plans to convert some of the 400 Winn-Dixie and Harvey's stores into Aldi stores. Then earlier this year, Southeastern Grocers bought back nearly 200 stores from Aldi. In Northeast Florida, 12 locations have been identified for conversion into Aldi stores. This first converted store opened back in March on Edgewood Avenue in Northwest Jacksonville. We stay mostly dry today here in Northeast Florida. Highs will reach the lower 90s inland with upper 80s along the coast. Overnight lows will drop down into the 70s.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Wallace Foundation, an independent, nonpartisan research foundation collaborating with grantees and partners in the arts, school leadership, and youth development. More at wallacefoundation.org. This is NPR.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, a massive bombardment targeting Iran's nuclear capabilities stands to radically redefine the balance of power and the future of diplomacy in the Middle East. We talked to a local public policy expert about the military, economic, and political implications. Later, how the march of red mangroves could impact the coastline and protect it, even as it harms some species that depend on it. But first, following an unprecedented attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, are we a nation at war? Here to discuss it is Rick Mullaney, director of the Shercliffe, executive director of the Public Policy Institute at Jacksonville University. Good morning, Rick. Nice to have you back.
Good morning, Ann. It's great to be with you.
So I want to ask you that. It's a question a lot of people are asking at this point. Are we at war?
Well, certainly, if you look at the vice president's answer yesterday on Meet the Press, he said we are not at war with Iran. We are at war with their nuclear program. And certainly anymore in this country, you have to ask the question, well, of course, it sounds like you're being engaged in a philosophical debate, but really, what does it mean to be at war? The last time we declared war was in the early 1940s in World War II. War with Korea, war with Vietnam were not declared wars. And even when we went into Iraq, that got an authorization from Congress, but no declaration of war per se. And of course, you said President Obama with the bombing of Libya back in 2011, were we at war then? So right now, if you go to the Trump administration, they view this as a limited, targeted execution on 3 nuclear sites that is designed to do away with their nuclear program and to bring them to the bargaining table to end what they're doing. I don't think if you ask them that question, in fact, Vice President Vance said it explicitly, they do not view us as being at war. If you were to ask Iran that, they may have a very different answer.
Well, let's take a listen. You mentioned the vice president speaking on Meet the Press this weekend. Let's hear a little of what he had to say.
We're not at war with Iran. We're at war with Iran's nuclear program. And the president has clear authority to act to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And the worst weapon of mass destruction of them all is nuclear. The idea that this was outside of presidential authority, I think any real serious legal person would tell you that's not true.
To your point, there is precedent in recent years, there really haven't been these declarations of war. The secrecy that surrounded this and surround a lot of our previous incursions would seem to preclude getting congressional approval in that way if you wanted to maintain secrecy. It's hard to imagine that an event that was as well kept as this one could have remained that way if they'd gone to Congress first.
Sir, you're going to the practicality of it, and you're exactly right on the practicality. Could you imagine having the debate in advance, getting it authorized, and then you find that all the uranium has been moved to another site as the Iranians are watching this debate play out in Congress? But if you go back to the Constitution on this, under Article 1, Congress does have the power to declare war, and of course they have the appropriations. authority, the power of the purse, which is really, really important. Under Article 2, however, the president is commander-in-chief, and under the 1973 War Powers Act, the executive branch can engage in those initial strikes, but after that, they have to notify Congress. And if they're going to have further escalation or further action, that requires within 60 to 90 days approval from Congress. So I think it's an uphill argument to suggest that for the president he did not have the authority. However, if he continues, the argument becomes much stronger and becomes a much more difficult circumstance if we continue down this path.
Of course, Bernie Sanders was speaking during a rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that got a lot of attention for his comments because he doesn't believe in that authority that the president has. Let's take a little listen to what he had to say.
It is so grossly unconstitutional. All of you know that the only entity that can take this country to war is the U.S. Congress. The president does not have the right.
So, the Article 1, Section 8, where it says that Congress has the power to declare war, very powerful, but you're talk about appropriations, the power of the purse. How does that play into this?
Really important, because one of the options certainly for Congress is to cut off funding. And they can actually cut off the funding for what you're doing, and that is the alternative that others point to. But the senator, a number of people do agree with him, but I think the majority probably take a little bit of a different view. But like I said, Ann, if this were to continue, and that is the question of the hour, what happens next? That really is the question that we're all asking. What happens next in terms of what Iran's going to do? How are they going to retaliate? Because it's a given that they're going to. So far, their retaliation has been limited, although this is significant, to attacks on Israel. But it begins to cross a line if those attacks go to U.S. military bases. What happens in the Strait of Hormuz, and what might that mean economically? What about terrorism around the globe? Those create something different. And if the president, the Trump administration, wants to continue down this path, and in his speech on Saturday night, he suggested that further action from the United States may be coming if, in fact, they cross that line. At that point, then you may have a very different circumstance with the need to go to Congress. But at this point, I think the president's on decent legal footing. And certainly if you look back at historical practice of other presidents, certainly that conduct is in line with what we've seen with other presidents.
Yeah. And so in terms of, what happens next, obviously there's a lot of possibilities and a lot of great minds are sort of looking at all of those things. But you mentioned a couple of them, whether there's retaliation directly on U.S. bases or, U.S. installations, or whether there's the threat of just terrorism. But I mean, in the short term, it does appear that a lot of the capabilities of Iran, whether it's from what the U.S. did this weekend or what the Israelis continue to do, even this morning, which is continuing in Tehran, there's a lot of capabilities that have been lost.
And you make a really good point. Clearly, that's the case. And why we, of course, are focused on what was a stunning operation by the United States, stunning in its execution, in its logistics, in its timing, in its secrecy, how it was carried out, the Tomahawk weapons coming out, missiles coming out of the submarines, the B-2 bombers, stunning in what we did. The real heavy lifting was 9 days ago by Israel. Israel had basically opened up the airspace, taken command of the sky so that we could fly in over Iran, drop the payload, and leave without a shot being fired. That's the direct result of what Israel had done. Israel's initial attack was stunning in its scope, its breadth, and in its intelligence. And now, after the United States has gone back in, Israel is continuing. So really, we've been understandably and rightfully focused on the operation because it was a historic and stunning decision on the president's part. But really what you've seen is that Israel, what happened 8-9 days ago when they first went in, really is what's taking command. So your point is Iran in a very weakened condition? That's true. They are. And I'm sure they're having an internal debate on how to respond. There's the short-term concern, but I think we may have embedded within Iran a desire for decades to come. We have to really measure what does this mean in the long run, because what they're going to do both in the near term and what they're going to do in the long term.
If you're just joining us, we were talking to public policy expert Rick Mullaney about this weekend's surprise attack by the U.S. on Iran's nuclear facilities. If you have questions or comments that you want to share, you can join the conversation by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on X, Instagram, or Facebook at FCC On Air. A comment from Ed on Facebook saying both Presidents Obama and Clinton did military actions without congressional approval, which is something you've kind of pointed out. This is a military town, Rick, and I just kind of want to ask a little bit about, how that changes how some people think about engaging in a short or long term war, like we're looking at here. I should say we reached out to the officials at Mayport, and they said that there are no local impacts to Mayport and no ships or sailors have deployed from Mayport in response to the U.S. strikes in Iran. But the USS Sullivan's is in the Mediterranean. That's something that they were deployed late last year for a different reason. The USS Winston Churchill also departed Mayport Saturday. But again, none of these known to be directly because of, and we're seeing some images of the USS Sullivan's right now if you're watching our live stream. Again, that they're not there in response, but like all troops, there's this sense of vulnerability.
Well, there is, and there's really high alert for our forces all around the globe. But remember, we have over 40,000 troops at various bases in the Middle East. In fact, we're in closer proximity to Iran than Israel is. So Iran,
Our troops, yeah.
Our troops are. So they could use conventional missiles to get there if they made that decision, which I think would be fateful and a big mistake on their part if they were to actually do that. But around the globe, there's a heightened alert. And so if the question is, what are we doing here? The answer, I think, is consistent with what you've heard. No direct impact right now, other than the fact I am confident that everybody is on high alert. That they've announced that we are. We don't know what comes next exactly, and that's one of the great challenges here. It's like I've said before, it's one thing to throw a punch, but it typically means another one's coming your way. And so we have to be prepared for what comes next. And we don't know exactly what that is.
Sure. And we know that there's been, an effort to evacuate, citizens in Israel, Americans that are there if they are wanting to leave. And also just some impacts in civilian life, airports that have shut down in the Middle East because there's been some sense that there might be GPS interference with some of these planes landing. And so, in Dubai, there's other places that have closed their air operations because of this weekend fighting.
A lot of precautions are being taken. You've seen that in U.S. embassies, which is one possible target. You've seen it on the high alert on our bases in the Middle East. You've seen it with the evacuation of American personnel, both in Israel, which by 700,000 or 800,000 Americans in Israel. So you're exactly right. There is this sort of tense anticipation of what may come. So far, this is between Iran and Israel as far as the back and forth, and a big launch by Israel today, but an attack yesterday by Iran against Israel. So it is a time of tremendous uncertainty.
Let's talk a little bit about impact, because we know that when this strike was announced, the president said that the facilities there were, quote, completely and totally obliterated. And then just a short while after, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and his defense secretary spoke about it in not quite as strong terms. And then yesterday, the vice president describing it as substantially delaying the nuclear program that Iran had advanced. We don't know yet, I guess, which is true.
Well, whether it's to the extent that the president portrayed, we don't know. It does appear from the reports this was very substantial, very significant, and a major setback for the nuclear program in Iran. In fact, even without our attack, the Israeli attack was a major setback for Iran. It will take some time to determine the exact extent of this. One thing to keep in mind is that Israel did not have the military capability to do this. I'm talking about the bunker busters in particular, the 7 planes and we dropped 14. And now you're seeing some follow-up today by Israel in those areas. But I have a great deal of respect for Israeli intelligence. I have a feeling they will know before anyone else, and that they may take the steps they think that are necessary, because one thing is clear from Israel's perspective. This represented a threat to their very existence, and they felt there was a compelling need to proactively take out this nuclear capability, because the trajectory of Iran was to get a nuclear weapon. You could look at the enrichment of the uranium, which is over 60%, well above what's needed for peaceful means. Nobody is really in doubt that they were on the pathway to a nuclear weapon. The debate is how far along that pathway. Was it weeks? Was it months? How far exactly is that? And some people, you've seen conflicting intelligence reports on that.
Well, it's no small matter, right? I mean, we should say that, just in March, Tulsi Gabbard was testifying to Congress saying that, according to the Intelligence Committee, quote, Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and that their supreme leader has, quote, not authorized the program that he suspended in 2003. Now, asked about that, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said um, that she was wrong. Tulsi Gabbard, presented that, and Trump said that she was wrong. Marco Rubio called it inaccurate, and then he later just said that's irrelevant. They have everything they need to build a nuclear weapon. Whether or not they're actively building a nuclear weapon kind of doesn't matter.
The notion that you've gotten past 60% enrichment on the uranium is in the eyes of many that's weapons. They're moving towards weapons grade. That's what that's for. There's no other purpose other than a nuclear weapon. And so I think the consensus is they're on that pathway. There's certainly a conflict as how far away they were. Of course, if you listen to Benjamin Netanyahu, it's tomorrow. He has said that for a long, long time, that they're always on the verge. But I don't think there's any doubt that that's their trajectory, that that's where Iran was going. You step back for a moment. For more than 4 decades, they've been one of the leading, if not the leading terrorist sponsor of terrorism in the world. Death to America, death to Israel. And that trajectory with nuclear weapons represent a very real and present danger to the existence of Israel, but beyond Israel, to peace in the region, security for the United States, and in fact, global peace. So it is you can't overstate the significance of the problem. That doesn't mean there's still differences of opinions on what our path should be, but I don't think there's a whole lot of difference on recognizing the fact that they're a terrorist country that represents a very significant threat to global peace.
There is a call that we've got. Cindy on the east side. Good morning, Cindy. Go ahead.
Good morning. So I just wanted to weigh in quickly a couple things. First of all, from my perspective, and I was an adult during the Iraq War, which started 20 years ago. I feel like this is a repetition of history. We are attacking a country that poses no threat to the United States whatsoever. I mean, we have a huge nuclear arsenal. Iran is not our problem. And yet we are starting another Middle East long-term conflagration war that could just spell death and suffering and destruction for years to come, not to mention the cost to the taxpayers and what it means for our own internal well-being and budget for the U.S. I think it's a disaster and a terrible mistake. So thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Cindy. Appreciate that. I mean, there is within even the Republican Party a big divide about whether or not this is the start of another forever war, concerned that this would be a repeat of Iraq. And so, Cindy's concerns are not, that is something that a lot of people are worried about.
The Cindy voices a concern that a number of people have, and there has been prior to the strikes. Certainly, the MAGA base was divided on this. They're the Steve Bannons of the world, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, the Marjorie Taylor Greens. All of them, the more isolationist wing of the party, were all anti-taking any action to go forward. There are others on the other side of that. That certainly would include Senator Lindsey Graham. It would include Tom Cotton. It would include Senator Cruz. They argue, however, and Cindy is understandably disappointed with the legacy of what happened in Iraq, but they would argue that analogy really doesn't apply here. We had deployed over 200,000 troops in Iraq. There is no intention from the president, pretty firm, that this doesn't involve ground troops. The other piece here is, as I mentioned earlier, unlike the weapons of mass destruction, that intelligence certainly was a failure. I don't think there's any doubt that on the 60% enrichment of this uranium heading towards a weapons-grade nuclear weapon, and the stated purpose of Iran to do that, and the destruction of Israel and the destruction of the United States. And by the way, she says it represents no threats to us. As the president pointed out in his speech on Saturday night, killed over 1,000 Americans in terrorist attacks over the years. And so those who are a little more on the hawkish side would argue that it's understandable that you don't want to repeat the mistakes of Iraq, clearly, but this is not Iraq. The threat is different. The approach is different. And what we're trying to accomplish is very different.
And you're kind of getting to a larger question that I do want to ask you, because while we're talking about, the decisions about why to go at this time, or, what the, what's being achieved, I think a lot of people just have a bigger question about, like, why are we getting involved in Iran, and why are we doing it now? Fairly recently, this president was trying to negotiate, a diplomatic solution to the question of nuclear capabilities in Iran. There are so many other issues going on globally, nationally right now.
Well, certainly one of the more hawkish people on this is John Bolton. And if you listen to his commentary on this, and he's been very involved in this in prior administrations, national security advisor, and I think he does give you an insight into the question, why now? President Trump started off wanting to negotiate this and gave Iran, 60 days in which to do it. And that did not happen. And on the 61st day, you saw the attack by Israel. After Israel's initial attack, President Trump again tried to negotiate with Iran, and they weren't interested. And I think in the end, there's a growing view on many that it was simply never going to happen, that the agreements in the past were foolhardy. All they did was potentially slow down nuclear weapons in development for Iran, but that is where Iran was going. And once you reach the conclusion that no agreement makes it possible, because the answer is, well, we should engage in diplomacy rather than strikes. And diplomacy has been the approach for 4 decades. But I think the president came to the conclusion that that approach was simply not going to work. That is the more hawkish approach of John Bolton. He felt it was not going to work. And therefore, a different path was needed. So I understand everybody would have preferred an agreement that would stop the nuclear program without the need for an attack by Israel, without the need for strikes by the United States. But unfortunately, there was one country that didn't agree with that, and that was Iran. They were going to continue, as I said, the trajectory towards those nuclear weapons. And so in answer to your question of why now, I think in the eyes, at least Israel, it was, in their view, inevitable that they would have to take it out because no one else was going to initiate that, and they initiated it. And I do believe that Israel's sort of stunning success in the early days paved the way. They did the heavy lifting, really, paved the way for President Trump to modify his view and to feel that a strike was appropriate. Now, history will be the judge of this.
Sure.
His action was bold, it was decisive, but it was incredibly risky, and we don't know what comes next. There will be those critics, understandably so. He certainly has put us in a position where there's a great deal of uncertainty and risk that we are facing. But I don't think, absent the heavy lifting done by Israel, the president would have taken the action that he did. Now we're at a point where can we, in fact, accomplish the goal of the eradication of those nuclear weapons? And Israel wants something more explicit. The president's kind of hinted at it. Israel wants regime change because they also want a country whose mission is not simply the destruction of the state of Israel.
I want to get to the question of regime change in a second, but when you're talking about the earlier attempts to use diplomacy, and certainly this current president, abandoned the deal that was reached by his predecessor, Barack Obama, saying it wasn't working. But, if those agreements were considered a failure because they were sort of, in your words, at best, delaying or potentially creating a slowdown, if in fact the nuclear capabilities in this strike were not destroyed and it is at best creating a delay as opposed to a total obliteration of that capability, would this be, how would this compare to the failed or not entirely successful diplomatic efforts, given that this is such a measure, an enormous step beyond that in terms of, strategy?
And you ask a really great question. I'll even pose it this way. One of the risks here is not only even assume we have obliterated their capability. We've obliterated it for now. And one of the concerns, remember, they're a country of over 90 million people. They have a substantial, about 200,000 in their Revolutionary Guard. They are meeting with Russia as we speak. And part of the concern is, do they double down in their commitment and determination to have a nuclear weapon? And then do they simply take the approach of other countries, such as Pakistan or others, and do it in secret? And because there are 9 nuclear powers in the world today, and so for Iran, it could very well be major setback, yes. Set you back years, yes. Is it over? Not so sure about that. The question is, do you have to come back and do this again at some point in the future? Are they simply going to become more secretive and more determined? And that's one of the challenges that we face.
David emailed to your question about why now, since they've been days away from a bomb for the last 20 years, to distract from what Netanyahu is doing in Gaza and to distract from Trump's disastrous administration in this country, plain and simple. We also have a call from Calder in Springfield. Go ahead, Calder.
Hi, echoing the comment that you just read, I think there's a huge blindside as we're talking about whether this was a strategic move to make. You've got thousands of children and women and families starving, trying to get food, being killed. The genocide in Gaza continues, which is also funded by the U.S. And I'm just wondering with your guest, what is the hypocrisy that we have so many nuclear weapons and we have this huge military complex, but yet any other country trying to defend themselves or get a nuclear weapon is going to be preemptively attacked, which you're not even considering if the goal here is to not proliferate and have terrorism. I mean, look at Gaza. What a better way to recruit people for Hamas than making more orphans. They're going to be angry at the United States. And the exact same thing is happening in Iran right now. And I think it's interesting with the media, they say we're taking out these nuclear sites, but zero mention is made of the civilians and the mothers and the families that are being killed. They are never mentioned. The same thing with Gaza. And I'm just wondering with your guests, here we are in this country. We've got homeless people. We've got no health care. We've got education that is not paid for. We have so many problems, and yet billions of dollars, trillions are being spent waging yet another war. Thank you.
Thanks, Calder.
Well, she raises a lot, and she talks about Gaza, and she's right to talk about the suffering there. But I would point out, however, what happened in Gaza, you go back to October 7th of 2023, that vicious attack on Israel, the slaughter of 1,200 Israelis, was sponsored and paid for and supported by Iran. And the suffering that you've seen in Gaza is it was Hamas who carried it out, but fully supported by Iran. In fact, they applauded it, the only country in the world to have applauded that massacre. And then what you've seen is Hamas using the people of Gaza, oftentimes as human shields in hospitals and schools and in other places. And so she is correct to talk about the fact that you have to look squarely at the suffering in Gaza and do something about it. We certainly, that's obvious. That does not mean, however, that Iran doesn't pose a nuclear threat. That is a separate and related, and in fact, it is an example of the trajectory that Iran's on as the one who is the state sponsor of Hezbollah. They're proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. And so her point is about a lot of challenges here at home. That's a fact. There are a lot of challenges here at home.
And prioritizing, right? I mean, I think one of her points would just be, is this the number one challenge that the U.S. faces, or should some of these other things come first?
Well, I think in the eyes of many, national security is always the number one responsibility of the federal government, the safety. And they take a look at this Middle East, which is truly fraught with all kinds of risks and dangers. And you can try to be more isolationist about it and withdraw, or you can take a look, what does this threat represent to the United States in the near term and in the long run? I do believe that the Trump administration believed that Iran represented a long-term threat, not simply to the survival of Israel, which is Israel's view, but also as a threat to the United States and global peace.
We've got a call from Doug in Fernandina. Just briefly, Doug, if you can go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi, Ann. Thanks for taking my call. I'm a former federal intelligence official with the Department of Defense. I was in charge of security during the WMD program and the lead up to the Iraq War. I just wanted to comment on something one of your former callers said about the intelligence that was put out in the lead up, that she is completely correct. What was put out to the United States public at large was entirely false. There was no actual indications that Iraq had any type of WMD program. We found no evidence of a biological or nuclear threat. And the only chemical weapons we found were sarin gas artillery rounds that were actually supplied to Iraq by the U.S. military themselves. So while Israel, as your guest says, Israel does have a vaunted intelligence program, they also have a vested interest in drawing the United States into a conflict with Iran for their own purposes. And so I think, what Tulsi Gabbard has said and what she has relayed is probably mostly accurate, not in keeping with what the administration wants to be put out to the public, but what the actual facts are on the ground. So I think your guest saying that they're going to trust the Israeli intelligence and what Israel is putting out to us and the world at large, I think needs to be taken with a large grain of salt.
Thanks, Doug. Good perspective.
Well, Doug is exactly correct on that's the legacy of Iraq. That's why Iraq is such a stain on the history, is because of what he just said. We now know what he just said is accurate. But I don't think the United States is simply trusting Israel intelligence. Independent intelligence and independent verification has suggested the enrichment of the uranium above 60%. Everyone knows that is heading towards weapons grade. Now, the timing is what people are disputing. Clearly, Netanyahu always says it'll be tomorrow. It'll be next week. President Trump has echoed some of those thoughts recently about how near he thought they were. But I don't think anyone doubts the fact that they have a nuclear program, that it's underground. In fact, the debate is, have they moved some of their uranium and their enriched uranium?
For one of those facilities.
That's been one of the big questions here. So I don't think the debate is the direction that Iran was heading on, or that they're a terrorist nation, or that they were backing Hamas and Hezbollah. That's not the debate. The debate is, was this the right strategic move given all the circumstances? And I think really smart people, really good people, can come to different conclusions on this question as to whether this was the right thing to do.
Well, Rick Mullaney, he is the Shercliffe Executive Director at the Public Policy Institute at Jacksonville University. Rick, we love getting your perspective. Thank you so much for coming in this morning.
Great being with you.
All right. Up next, how the northward march of the red mangrove could help and possibly harm local ecosystems. Welcome back. A tropical trajectory brings a South Florida plant into and now north of the First Coast. Joining us to talk about this shifting boundary of the red mangrove is Michael Adno. Michael lives in Sarasota. He's written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, and Rolling Stone, and his recent story about the migration of the red mangrove appeared in Scientific American. He joins us now via video. Good morning, Michael. Welcome back.
Hey, Ann. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to talk to you. I want to start by talking about the red mangrove, its migration. You talk about it as a symbol of coastal resilience and then also a possible cause for concern. Can you kind of break down what the mangrove, what purpose it serves, and why it could be both things at the same time?
So there's like 70 different species of mangroves around the world, but here in the United States, especially in Florida, we just have 3. And so red, white, black, but essentially they're central to the tropics in terms of building land and protecting the coast. And they're also, essential to all these different types of species, fish, birds. And what's interesting is that as they're moving, that's changing these habitats. And to your point, it's, there's resilience in the sense that it protects against storm surge, hurricane force winds, so on and so forth. But it's a cause for concern because as those mangroves move, they're replacing habitats that are, critical to, say, you talk about Jacksonville, you think of salt marsh, they're going to replace Spartina grass at some point. So it's kind of this push-pull.
Yeah. And so your story really tracks this remarkable migration because for many, many years, people believed that, red mangrove in particular were basically confined to points south of South Florida and therefore south. And you have been looking at the way that it's moved, the way that people in the world of ecology or park service have followed it. And you actually were part of a discovery of just how far it has gone. Can you tell us a little bit about, what it was that you found and what these researchers are finding?
So the story of their research is as fascinating as the research itself. And that is because basically the Smithsonian researcher named Ilka Feller, who goes by Candy, was called in 2002, 20 years ago, and she was asked to come look at this site near Merritt Island, which is, in between Kennedy Space Center, Cocoa Beach area. And there was this big expansion of black mangroves there. And so she drove up from Fort Pierce, where she lives, and she went to look. And this was the northern edge of where researchers believed, or ecologists believed, this plant could grow. And that's because they can't tolerate freezing temperatures. So they're kind of bound to the southern part of the subtropics and largely go throughout the tropics. But she went up to Merritt Island, and this plant is not supposed to be there, and it was everywhere. And then later that afternoon, she drove 70 miles north to Tomoka State Park in Ormond Beach, and she asked the park ranger, have you seen any mangroves in the salt marsh, a little shrubby plant? And the park ranger says, no, you have to go to South Florida to find mangroves. Anyway, Candy drove into the park, and she found mangroves there. And then the next morning, she drove another 40 miles north, and just south of St. Augustine, she found black mangroves just south of St. Augustine near Matanzas. That's only 60 miles south of the Georgia border. So it was this really, remarkable find. And then over the last 20 years, what her and this big band of researchers have done is they've shown how two species, black and red mangroves, have consistently moved further and further north, far outside, the border of what they believe that plant could grow. And so, that continues. They found a really large black mangrove on the south end of Amelia Island in 2016. And then in 2021, they found a red mangrove a little further north in the Nassau River. And so that's exciting. That's this, clear story of climate change and how these plants are, tracing this, this journey. But what was wild is that when those plants were discovered in 2016 and then a little later, is that Candy thought, oh, well, maybe I should look at the historical record. Maybe there's some anecdotes, right? And what she found is that John Muir, in 1916, in a book called A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf, which was published after his death, he described mangroves on the St. Mary's River, which would have been significantly further north than Candy and these other researchers had even discovered mangroves. So why a century ago were there mangroves there? And then she found another record that was in 1837, one in 1821, and then all the way back to 1788 of mangroves being there. So that ran counter to what they believed, that these mangroves had never grown there before. And so they basically set out to figure out why that was. And what they did is they took 3 records: freezes, storms, and then they took aerial images that were collected by NASA going back to the 1940s. And what they revealed is that mangroves had grown that far north at one point, but that they had expanded north, and then when a big freeze came, they all died back, and they were replaced by salt marsh. And so it's kind of this dance where these mangroves have been moving north, falling south, and continuing to move north as, we have less and less freezes in the southeast.
And so I think some would say, well, if it's part of the historical record going back to John Muir and earlier, how is this a function of climate change? I mean, if it's been happening and it was north of where we typically think of this population of mangroves growing, isn't it just part of a cyclical evolution?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's was so rewarding as somebody who didn't know what this was, but it's essentially, it's called a regime shift. And it's so when there's these really long term, centuries long scale of patterns in nature, it's called a regime shift in this kind of sophisticated back and forth. So yes, in one, decade, those things can move 100 miles north, and then one freeze, they all fall back and they're replaced by Spartina grass and, different grasses that you see all around Jacksonville. But the difference now is that they're not just seeing a tiny shrub. They're seeing these established, dense, mature stands of mangroves, and that's continuing. And so for a long time at the National Park Service, there is an ecologist named William Vervecchi, and then at University of North Florida. There's a professor who's also an ecologist named Scott Jones, and they had been working with Candy because she's largely known as the kind of mangrove queen and one of the leaders of research. She's published 700 papers. She's worked all around the world studying mangroves, and so they've always imagined that the big this line that could be crossed was finding mangroves in Georgia, right north of the St. Mary's River. So last year, it was January, they went looking, and I got to tag along, and that day they found 21 new northernmost mangroves. 19 of them were further north than previously discovered, and those were all in Florida, like around the Fernandina area. And then in the afternoon, we went into Georgia, and near St. Mary's, Georgia, just on the northern side of the river, they found the first black mangrove in Georgia. And that was like a remarkable find that had not been discussed in historical records. There's no anecdotal evidence of that. And that's what they had been looking for forever. So, I mean, when Scott and William, who goes by Ches, saw that's like a life-changing career moment for them.
Yeah, and you got to witness that. And so this really is a remarkable finding. I want to ask you, though, it's almost like an Easter egg hunt when you're, recounting this trip up further north and finding these. And it's kind of exciting. And, maybe even a little bit celebratory to find these things. But ultimately, they do portend potential problems for those environments, those ecosystems that they're in.
So what's really exciting about that is, yes, like when you're looking for them, like that was so much fun. And, finding the first one was like just a huge celebration. And then obviously you found 20 others. So it was less exciting. I mean, finding the one in Georgia was incredible. But what is, a little troubling about it is that mangroves build land, right? They have this kind of knot of roots that grow into the ground and above the water, and they grow in these kind of interstitial tidal areas. So they can handle water rising and water being very low because of the length of their roots. And what they do is they trap sediment, and that builds land. And then the mangroves continue to kind of build up this coastline. Like in South Florida, it's called the walking tree because it built the coastline essentially. And as they go into, the areas that they settle are these big flats of, Spartina grass and this marsh area, is that they build land much faster than Spartina grass does, but they're not able to withstand freezes. So if you get like one of these, remarkable 100-year freeze events, all those mangroves will disappear, and then all of that land that they're growing in becomes incredibly vulnerable to erosion. Whereas grasses, Spartina grasses, all the things that grow in the marsh are, absolutely hardy, and it's easy for them to deal with cold. So they're less a threat of disappearing and kind of erosion risk.
And so we could celebrate. Yes, this could help coastal resiliency, but also could be very vulnerable in the event. All of that land could be vulnerable in the event of a freeze. But I also want to ask you, because, if it were to displace parts of the marsh or large portions of the marsh, there's also some birds that might fall victim to that. And it's something that you also reported on, eastern black rails, whimbrels, salt marsh sparrows, all of those depending on that Spartina environment.
Yeah, I mean, it goes both ways. I mean, you're creating habitat for a lot of things. A lot of things are going to have more habitat, right? I mean, you have to think about there's this massive loss of mangroves around the world. So new ones are, that's a net. That's a great thing. But also things that are using the salt marsh, these open expanses are, they're losing habitat. So, there are theories about what will happen there. But if you go to like, just south of St. Augustine, and you see how the salt marsh and mangroves are kind of interacting, is that you have this balance, and there's this, there still is open expanses, but then there are the kind of dense mangrove stands. And so it's not going to be that one is going to completely outpace and swallow the other. It's that there's kind of a mix of those things. And then even more complicated is that as those species that, these avian species that both use those kinds of habitats, as they overlap, then you kind of have this issue of what is their forage, like what are they eating? And they're both competing for that now suddenly. So at that point, it's a little bit theoretical of what's going to happen to those species. But it is this really interesting dance where it's going to bring a lot of species in. It's going to displace some. Where are they going to go?
Well, Michael, we're gonna have to leave it there. But thank you so much. You can read his article in Scientific American. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Ann.
All right, up next, how to jumpstart your child's formal education at no cost.
Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. Highway, hospital, home, work. Where injuries happen can make a difference in the law and the outcome.
More at terrellhoganlaw.com. Life South Community Blood Centers, providing blood and patient services to the local hospitals, serving patients in this community. Donating blood with Life South helps save lives. More at lifesouth.org to find a blood drive near you.
Looking for a cool escape this summer? Catch the classic film noir DOA at WJCT Studios, Wednesday, July 2nd. Doors at 6:30, movie at 7. It's a special summer noir night, because who says we have to wait for Noir-vember to get our mystery fix?
I want to report a murder. Who was murdered? I was.
Killer vibes, vintage style, and a story that still hits hard. Grab your tickets now at wjct.org/film. DOA. See it before time runs out.
In 1941, a young William F. Buckley watched Charles Lindbergh speak at an America First committee rally in New York.
The argument that came out of the right, which Buckley was involved with, was that the media was trying to censor and silence Lindbergh. Sound familiar?
William F. Buckley and the creation of modern American conservatism. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11, here on WJCT News 89.9.
Donald Trump's new Commission on Religious Liberty met last week for the first time. When he signed the executive order establishing the group last month, he openly questioned the idea of separation of church and state, saying, quote, "We're bringing religion back to our country and it's a big deal." For the next installment of our politics series, If You Can Keep It, how the Trump administration is attempting to redefine the relationship between religion and government. Next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Despite what you think, summer might be the best time to start thinking about back to school. Here to tell us about a new initiative that aims to increase enrollment in a free early learning program is Angel Caro, President and CEO of the Early Learning Coalition of Duval. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here. We're also welcoming LaShonda Hicks. She's the group's Chief Program Officer. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
So first of all, if you could just start, what is the Early Learning Coalition of Duval? What is the mission? What is the work that you do?
Yeah, so we're a 501c3 nonprofit that receives federal and state funding to help families with childcare. We have two major programs: the School Readiness Program that helps families of low income get paid for childcare, and then the VPK program, the state's free pre-K program that helps families enroll in pre-kindergarten.
And are those, in fact, separate? I think a VPK is also, I mean, that's available to everyone, right?
So yeah, so there are two separate programs. The VPK program is specifically for 4-year-olds in Florida. The School Readiness Program, we actually serve up to age 13. Our main focus is 0 to 5 for families needing help with childcare.
Okay. So VPK, a lot of people are just kind of getting to their summer mode. LaShonda, they're not necessarily thinking about, getting the supplies and the clothing and everything for back to school. Why is now a good time for people to start thinking about VPK?
I think because you need to do your research. Although all of our VPK programs do produce, qualified teachers, you want to find a program that fits your needs beginning in the fall. And I think now is a good time to start help them transition into a VPK program because it is a little bit more structured to help prepare them for kindergarten.
For people who aren't familiar, tell us a little bit about how VPK differs from daycare, because we're talking about a very young cohort of kids,
Yeah.
and it is an educational program. But I mean, what's it designed for, and how is it different from just a kind of caretaking facility?
Yeah, so with VPK, the teachers have to be qualified, meaning they have to have a CDA um, or higher. Some have associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees. There's additional training that they are required to take, and so they're just more qualified um, to teach in a VPK classroom, and their training is specific to helping children prepare for kindergarten. There's a set of Florida standards that they have to be trained on, again, which helps them to transition into kindergarten. So it's more than just daycare. They're actually qualified to be in the classroom to help kids learn and develop in several content areas.
Florida is still fairly unique in offering free educational programs for kids this age and to all kids. So VPK is kind of unique, but the idea of having to prepare for kindergarten, and we were talking about that a little bit earlier, Angel, is something for people to get their heads around, because that kindergarten really used to be the entree into education, and it was like maybe you're learning your you tie your shoes, you get the ABCs, very kind of rudimentary skills, and that's almost no longer the expectation when you arrive in kindergarten.
Correct. The teachers, when kids go through VBK, it gets them ready for kindergarten. So when they arrive, they're ready to learn. They get that social emotional experience being with other children, which helps them evolve better once they get to kindergarten.
Yeah, and kindergarten sometimes can be more challenging without that preparation, Lashonda.
Absolutely. I just think about, my kids all went through the VPK program, and so I'm used to dropping them off and leaving. And so in the classroom during the regular VPK day, they're used to structure. They're used to, okay, time's up at this. It's time to transition to the next activity. And so they're learning a lot about, just the classroom expectations, of being in a school or in a classroom. Like Angel said, they're learning social skills throughout the day. But not only that, VPK teachers are trained to work with them math, reading, science, all those things that they're exposed to, and also the social elements of being in a classroom. So, having all of that and transitioning to a kindergarten classroom, there are going to be some bumps here or there, but children kind of walk into those classrooms with the expectations of, okay, mom's leaving, it's circle time, I have to sit on the carpet, and now it's time to transition to the next activity. For kids that aren't exposed to that and they've been at home, and that's great, but they may not be exposed to that structure and being able to
Right.
interact with other kids and understand the concept of time and what those expectations are.
We've got just about a minute, but tell us what's going on now in terms of the sign up and the unique partnership that you guys have formed with the city of Jacksonville.
Yeah, so the Jacksonville Civic Council and community partners have been working on the Epic Jacks campaign, which is specifically aimed to making meaningful community change in Jacksonville. One of the goals for Epic Jacks is to have Jacksonville be the number one city in the United States by 2032 in getting kids ready for kindergarten. So we've been doing 90-day sprints. The current sprint was specifically focused on that goal of getting kids ready for kindergarten. So we're trying to increase VPK enrollment. So next June, June 30th, next Monday, we'll be doing the big kickoff for the Epic Jacks VPK community-wide campaign.
And where can people get information if they want to be a part of that kickoff or if they want to start the process
Yeah.
of looking?
So they can go to our website, elcduval.org, to get all the information from our website. Also, parents could call us at 904-208-2044, and our staff could walk through them through the process of getting enrolled for VPK and also helping find a quality childcare center.
All right. Well, Angel Caro, Lashonda Hicks, thanks so much for being here this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right. And thank you for listening. That's our program. Join us tomorrow when we discuss how Florida's first fatal bear attack impacted support for a
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The law offices of Phillips, Hunt & Walker proudly support WJCT, Personal injury, criminal defense, and family law. Phillips, Hunt, and Walker, committed to justice. 904-444-4444 or floridajustice.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR